Have you ever watched a movie and thought, this is great, can't wait for the sequel? And then when you actually saw the sequel, you said to yourself, man, they really should have left this alone after one? Well then this is the show for you. Welcome to Sequelpalooza.
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 Sequel.
The series that takes a hit movie, asks what happened next, and discovers that it's usually a complete and utter mess. In each episode, we'll be telling the story of a different film series from across the decades. And for the first ever edition, we're taking a look at one of the most memorable films of the 1980s. A timeless classic fantasy film which still resonates to this day. And the franchise of sequels that followed in its wake. The NeverEnding Story is a stone cold banger. Not just another cookie cutter Hollywood movie off the production line. In fact, Hollywood had very little to do with its production at all. As the NeverEnding Story did attempt to court the American market more in the 1990s, however, things perhaps took one of the steepest declines we will ever cover in this series. But where did it all go wrong? How rough did things get? And could anything have been done to stop the crash?
Mr. Simpson, this is the most blatant case of fraudulent advertising since my suit against the film The NeverEnding Story.
The NeverEnding Story ends in flames. This is Sequelpalooza. Hi, Culture Slice here. We're in Munich, Germany, and the year is 1984, and we are having it large in one of the city's many discotheques. Sorry, got a bit carried away remembering my days as a presenter on European clubbing TV for a second. Anyway, as I was saying, it is spring 1984, and the people of Munich are awaiting the release of what was, at this stage, the most expensive film ever made outside of America or the Soviet Union. Because yes, The NeverEnding Story is very much a German movie, adapted from one of the country's most iconic books of the era and produced by a German production company. At this point, we were still 5 years away from the fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification. But in West Germany at least, the release of a movie version of The NeverEnding Story was becoming a huge cultural moment. The film would be an adaptation of Michael Ende's novel, Die unendliche Geschichte, aka The NeverEnding Story. A book which, upon its release in 1979, had topped the German bestsellers list for 113 consecutive weeks. One person who was a fan was director Wolfgang Petersen, who by the early 1980s had become Germany's hottest director after his submarine war film Das Boot grossed over $84 million and ended up being nominated for 6 Oscars, including Best Director for Petersen himself. After spending 3 years underwater, the director wanted a complete change of pace and to make a film that his young son could actually watch. As fate would have it, The NeverEnding Story was scheduled to be made at Munich's Bavaria Studios and was in urgent need of a director, after original director Helmut Diel had decided the project was too much for him, and it was a project which captured not just his own, but the nation's imagination. The NeverEnding Story was a true event and something that we didn't have in Germany for a long time, that millions and millions of people, especially kids, were reading. It was big news in Germany. The film would cover the first half of the book, leaving open a clear opportunity for a sequel, and maybe even a series of movies. The NeverEnding Story told the, story of Bastian, a young boy grieving the loss of his mother and dealing with bullies making his life even more difficult. When he steals a book, The NeverEnding Story, from a bookstore he is hiding from his bullies in, Bastian's imagination enters the magical world of Fantasia, which is slowly being devoured by an invisible dark force known as the Nothing. With Fantasia's childlike empress becoming increasingly ill, the kid warrior Atreyu sets off on a quest to find a cure and save Fantasia, as Bastian's own world becomes more and more entangled with the one he is reading in the book. Being largely set in Fantasia, altered slightly from its name of Fantastica in the book, allows for the introduction of numerous new weird and wonderful characters, including Falcor the Luck Dragon. Man, what I would have given to have a luck dragon when I was a kid. Anyway, the production was a notoriously difficult one. Writer Ender, who sold the rights to producers Dieter Giesler and Bernd Eichinger and initially helped Peterson with the screenplay, would eventually become so furious with the treatment of his work that he sued the makers to try to shut production down and later demanded his name be removed from the finished film. The shoot just slightly ran late. Originally scheduled for 3 months, it would instead go on for a whole year. The largely handmade effects and characters made progress painstakingly slow. The film went massively over budget. It ended up being made for 60 million Deutschmarks, or $27 million, a huge amount in Germany at the time. The NeverEnding Story didn't feature any stars' names on the poster, with the inexperienced likes of Tammy Stronach as the childlike empress and Barrett Oliver as Bastian, though Noah Hathaway, who played Atreyu, had been in Battlestar Galactica. The young stars were worked hard, sometimes requiring 40 takes per scene, and Hathaway even nearly lost an eye when the animatronic wolf Gamork slashed his face for real. But the sense of wonder in the finished product was undeniable. The combination of real life and model sets, animatronics and blue screen effects created an entirely believable world. The fact that Peterson was a surprising choice for a movie that would largely be aimed at kids actually played into the NeverEnding Story's favour. There were moments of legitimate terror and also real emotional impact. It captures the value and power of a kid's imagination as well as any film I could name. Seeing the movie as an adult, you of course draw different meanings. The Nothing, the all-consuming, unstoppable villain of the piece, strikes me as a metaphor for depression and feels strangely beautiful because of it. This is a kids' movie that tackles big themes and features one of the most harrowing losses of an animal cinema will ever see. Truly, Atreyu's horse Artax being consumed by the swamp of sadness is burnt into my brain for life. It is one of the most heartbreaking scenes committed to film across the entire decade. There are bleak moments for a family film, but it's that very light and shade that is part of what makes it so special. It seems like for many fans of the book, this is a film that works without being a completely devoted adaptation, which is not in itself a problem, I guess, even if devotees of Ender's work might disagree. Adapting well-loved source material to the big screen is not straightforward, and some liberties will inevitably often need to be made to create a cohesive film vision. A book can be great, and a movie inspired by that book can also be great at the same time, even if it might not religiously follow every element of the text. Those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive, but I get being a hardcore fan might give someone a different perspective. Or for Michael Ender, sent over the edge by Peterson's alterations, not least bringing proceedings back to the real world for the finale, didn't agree. He declared that it was a gigantic melodrama of kitsch, commerce, plush and plastic. Wow, if he thought the first one was bad, he must have absolutely hit the roof when he saw the sequels. Anyway, The NeverEnding Story was released in Germany on April 6, 1984, and perhaps unsurprisingly, performed incredibly well, raking in $20 million, a feat rarely seen by a German-made film. Prior to the US release, Steven Spielberg helped Peterson re-edit the movie for the American audience, and truly legendary producer Giorgio Moroder delivered the theme song, sung by Limahl of 80s pop hitmakers Kajagoogoo. It's one of the most memorable from an era of entirely memorable movie theme songs. The film is backed by a beautiful score from Klaus Doldinger, a regular collaborator for Peterson's work. Reviews at the time for the movie were pretty mixed. Roger Ebert loved it, for example, but his TV partner Gene Siskel most definitely did not.
NeverEnding Story is okay, I guess, in that it is innocent fun, but personally I didn't care for it. I found it much too long. The art direction makes the film look cheap, as I said, and the special effects didn't dazzle this 38-year-old. The little boy reading the book was okay as a character, but the young warrior boy, a dullard. I know the film wasn't made for people my age. I still didn't care for it.
I enjoyed this movie. The special effects didn't look cheesy to me. They had a lot of invention to them.
Yeah.
The whole romantic idea of this little kid's imagination all appealed to me.
Despite critical circles not universally praising the film, Warner Brothers must have been hopeful that the film could catch fire at the box office when it made its debut in American cinemas a few months later. In the end, the movie disappointed at US cinemas in the summer of '84, taking just $21.3 million. But if you look at the sheer insane standard of the films in the top 10 of the first week of its American release, maybe the congested schedule makes its underperformance a bit more understandable. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, the 1980s was a truly glorious time for film fans. As it opened in more and more territories over the next year though, the rest of the world took the NeverEnding Story into their hearts. Global box office exceeded $100 million, and in the years that followed, the film would prove a success in the home video and TV markets. Even if it has been labelled as goofy and cheesy in some quarters, fans of the film have become more passionate by the year, and the NeverEnding Story has endured an undeniable magic with those of a certain generation, like me. It was one of the first videos I ever asked my parents to watch. Watching it again, I thought to myself, if only more films like this were released today. Back in the mid-80s, the second half of the book that inspired the NeverEnding Story film was ready to be made into a successful follow-up. In theory, a sequel did seem inevitable, whether Michael Ende liked it or not. I mean, this was the NeverEnding Story after all. But could lightning possibly strike twice for Germany's biggest 80s blockbuster? Or were the franchise and its viewers heading towards the swamp of sadness?
Bastian made many other wishes and had many other amazing adventures before he finally returned to the ordinary world. But that's another story.
The reality is that making sequels is hard. For every success, there are countless failures. Any number of issues can arise when attempting to get the band back together, and the NeverEnding Story 2 would end up facing most of them. The original plan had been to make a sequel fairly rapidly, but Michael Ende's continued disdain for the film which had been made from his work rumbled on beyond the first film's success, and litigation continued. The author demanded creative input across all future film iterations of his work. Though Ende lost in court, he did eventually agree to a second film being made. But this all took time, and wasted time for a sequel can be a major problem. The NeverEnding Story had dropped in 1984, and it was now 1989, 5 years later, and the first stages of production were only just able to begin. The film would not see the light of day until late 1990 in Germany, and it wouldn't be until 1991 that it would arrive at US cinemas. The movie landscape was entirely different at this point. The first NeverEnding Story had landed at a time when Hollywood was in the middle of a fantasy film bonanza, a seemingly endless stream of sorcery and magical lands. The only problem was, they weren't cheap to do well, and even if some are remembered fondly today, a lot of those movies bombed at the box office. By the end of the 1980s, that moment had well and truly passed. Director Wolfgang Peterson had finally made his move to Los Angeles after the first film had wrapped, and would not return to Fantasia. For his second film in a row, he had stepped in to replace the original director on a troubled project, this time the sci-fi movie Enemy Mine, which flatlined completely in theatres upon release. For the NeverEnding Story 2, the producers decided to only bring in a director later in the process, after Karen Howard's screenplay had been completed, and only when production was ready to begin. This would be Howard's first ever film screenplay. The director they chose was the Scottish-born Australian George T. Miller, not to be confused with the other Australian director George Miller, who has made all the Mad Max films and Babe. Sadly, they weren't able to secure him. After delays upon delays, the young actors who had been established in the first film were now all way too old to reprise their roles. Replacing some of the cast from the first film is dodgy ground for a sequel, but to replace essentially all of them? Things were looking tough for the NeverEnding Story 2 from the jump. So let's break it down. New director drafted in at the last minute, new screenwriter with little to no experience, more than half a decade after the first film's release, completely new lead cast, and made years after the fantasy film trend of the 80s had ended. But they did have the characters of Fantasia, the data which showed a strong second life in home viewing, and that killer theme tune. Although even that hadn't been in the charts for more than half a decade, and the musical zeitgeist had massively shifted as well. Plus in the second one, it's performed by someone called Joe Milner, who, as far as Discogs can tell me, hasn't ever released anything that is not related to the NeverEnding Story 2. Milner also provides vocals for Dreams We Dream, a new theme song for the second part and another Giorgio Moroder number. It's not a patch on the theme from the first film. The majority of the score for part 2 comes from Robert Falk, who does a decent enough job, but his masterpiece has, and always will remain, yes, the Police Academy theme. What a banger that is. Anyway, by the time production began in earnest, any sense of momentum had been completely lost. When it came down to the cast, the only actor returning from the first film was Thomas Hill, the bookshop owner, so the producers had their work cut out. The part of Bastian went to Jonathan Brandis, Kenny Morrison played Atreyu, and Alexandra Jones became the childlike Empress. Zaida, the evil sorceress of the piece, was played by Carissa Burt. Seemingly fearful of similar delays to the first film, and perhaps working under the guidelines of returning producer Dieter Giesler, director Miller ensured that the film was shot at a fast pace, only taking 4 months for this one rather than the whole year it took for part 1. And there is a sense of things being rushed in the final film, even if it took so many years after part 1 to see the light of day. The NeverEnding Story 2 follows Bastian as he embarks upon a journey into Fantasia, when he heeds the call of the childlike Empress. An invisible force has trapped the childlike Empress in her castle and threatens Fantasia's existence. Again, this is the work of Zaida, who then attempts to erase all of Bastian's memories. You see, all that can save the childlike Empress and Fantasia itself are the wishes of Bastian, though every time he uses one, he also loses a memory from his own life. Zaida and her cronies, including Nimbly, a bizarre-looking and pretty annoying bird creature thing, attempt to fool Bastian into using them up before he can save the magical land. Or something. The reviews were, yeah, not great, though some saw a bit of merit for younger viewers. Most saw it for what it was, an inferior follow-up, a film which had been made with great effort and no charm, with little going for it except its references to part 1, and that the movie was as flat as the pages of its script. Most critics agreed that it was a totally unneeded sequel which does nothing whatsoever for the legacy of the original tale. Unlike part 1, part 2 has also not grown in stature with age, and for good reason. By this stage, the magic was gone. I couldn't find much about Michael Ender's thoughts on this second installment, but I can't see how he would have enjoyed it. The script hacks together sections of his book and incorporates characters, but the story and dialogue here meanders along without any sense of wonder. And the same can be said for the special effects. Despite the increased budget, reportedly pegged at $35 million, it's difficult to see where that extra money was spent. Most of the returning Fantasia characters look off-puttingly different. I mean, just look at Falcor. The poor guy looks knackered. Equally, the new residents of Fantasia never have much charm to begin with, especially when compared to the first film. The human cast are fine, I guess, even if it's always odd having a completely new cast replacing already recognised faces. but director Miller doesn't seem to prioritize eliciting much emotional depth from them in the way Wolfgang Petersen did. Apparently, there were numerous drafts of the script delivered by Howard before the producers signed it off, but really, this was the one they gave the green light to? A pound-shot retread of the invisible menace from the first film, but this time with added pantomime villains on top and minus any attempts at deeper meaning. This feels like the series' first try at lurching towards appealing more to an American audience, but it's not done in a way which carried a through line from part 1. The first movie seems somewhat special, unique. This is just another film, and not a particularly good one. The NeverEnding Story 2 was released in Germany with the subtitle of In Search of Fantasia in the autumn of 1990. Though it was a success and one of the now reunified country's biggest hits of the year, total admissions of 3.2 million were almost 2 million down on the first film. After a Christmas rollout across the likes of Japan, Australia and the UK, Warner Bros. Launched the renamed NeverEnding Story 2 in US cinemas in February of '91. Once again hitting 4th place in the box office top 10 on the first week of its release, the next chapter failed to overtake Home Alone, which had been on release for 22 weeks at this point. In the end, the film grossed just over $17 million in North America, which, although a drop-off from part 1, was within 75% of the box office gross of the first film. Although when the first film was considered to be a bit of a bomb in the US, it's still maybe not so great. Though precise data is difficult to come by, Tim Hampton, who executive produced the second film and would end up producing part 3, because yes, there is a part 3, noted that the first 2 films combined grossed $150 million at the worldwide box office. Given part 1 hit almost 100 million exactly, one can then surmise that part 2 made around $50 million, or half the original film. Something which movies used to be able to fall back on, however, was video sales and rentals. Though the streaming system has completely upended this revenue source nowadays, even bad films could get a second life from video sales. And The NeverEnding Story 2 was another success on video, with strong sales leading to the notion of the third film being a goer. And this time, in the US at least, it could theoretically be a success without even making it to cinemas at all. Especially if the film could flip the entire concept of the NeverEnding Story on its head and bring the residents of Fantasia to Earth, and put Bastian in high school to try to tap into that teen market. What on earth could go wrong? It would be the mid-90s before another NeverEnding Story film would see the light of day. And when I say see the light of day, it would be more accurate to say that it stumbled out of bed half drunk the morning after a massive night out, and then fell down the stairs. In early 1993, producer Dieter Giesler, the only constant presence to be part of the franchise's production from the beginning, and his new partner Tim Hampton, announced that the prequel would indeed be making its way to screens, and that it would have little to do with what had come before. In fact, as Hampton put it at the time, worldwide success was no longer the priority. They wanted more US market penetration. Both earlier films were not such big draws in the States as they were, say, Germany. That's why we've opened up the script a great deal, to stop it being a movie obviously just for 8-year-olds. Author Michael Ender would have nothing to do with the process this time. Aside from his characters and places being in the thing, the producers now had carte blanche to do as they pleased with the residents of Fantasia. We own all the rights to the title now. Michael Ender had certain rights on the previous 2 movies, but here we're clear and free to do what we want. To that end, the producers hired American Jeff Lieberman to deliver the screenplay. Lieberman had been known for writing and directing cult horror films such as Blue Sunshine and Just Before Dawn, as well as making the bonkers 1988 Alien VHS sci-fi romantic comedy, Remote Control. With the story centering around the Fantasia cast making the journey to Earth, Jim Henson's Creature Shop were hired to design creatures that were convincing in scenes in the real world. I say this with love and as a huge fan of Jim Henson and the Henson Company's work, but not even they could save this one. In search of a director, they ended up hiring Brit Peter MacDonald, who had previously taken the reins of Rambo 3 in the late 80s and also made the 1992 Damon Wayans vehicle Mo Money, which, for me, is an underrated early 90s comedy if you haven't seen it. He'd also worked on the likes of Labyrinth, Legend, The Empire Strikes Back and Batman, so theoretically this was a good choice. But things clearly didn't run smoothly. After the shoot finished, MacDonald was essentially locked out of the NeverEnding Story 3 edit suite as the producers took an even more ironclad grip on the series. To further attempt to, as the producers put it, broaden the franchise's appeal, Jason James Richter was brought in as the third different Bastion in 3 films. Richter had just had his big break with Free Willy, a film which saw him befriend an orca whale and that took home over $150 million at cinemas in 1993. Cast as the main villain of the prequel was a very young Jack Black, who had barely been in any films at this stage, but still manages to be the best thing in this one. You can see the star potential, as bad as the material is. The NeverEnding Story 3 saw a now teenage Bastion, whose father had remarried, leaving him with a well-meaning mother-in-law and a stepsister who didn't like him. His new sibling thinks he's a loser, and Bastion has also found himself the target of Jack Black's group the Nasties, with a naff prologue having already informed us of a prophecy that the Nasty would one day arrive in Fantasia. Escaping the Nasty Boys, the Nasties, Bastion finds both the bookkeeper and the NeverEnding Story book in the school library for some reason, although both look strangely different, and travels back to Fantasia. But Jack Black gets the book in the real world, starts to use it against the magical land, along with some unexpected Fantasia faces who also travel through dimensions in the most ridiculous way imaginable. From there, chaos ensues, junior rockbiters climb up Mount Rushmore, Falcor gets involved in some ridiculous airline product placement, and the whole thing descends into even more of a painful mess of a movie. Warner Bros. Had an option to buy the worldwide rights for Part 3, but in a sign of where things were by this stage, they decided against it, instead agreeing to release it in Germany, where some success was guaranteed no matter the quality of the film, as well as the UK, Spain, Japan, and a few other territories. In the US though, presumably having watched the absolute state of the newest installment, they decided against taking up their option to distribute Escape from Fantasia in North American cinemas. The NeverEnding Story 3 was released in October 1994 in Germany without having secured a US distributor, and it went on to gross $5 million, but it wouldn't make an appearance in North America until February 1996, after Miramax had eventually picked it up. Though it got a limited release in theatres, Miramax's main interest was to release the thing on video, and it barely saw the light of day in North American cinemas. Reviews were relatively scarce, but what there were didn't exactly deliver ringing endorsements. One reviewer summed it up very handily: the NeverEnding Story lives up to its title in the worst way possible. The fact that this film even exists in real life is pretty mind-blowing. It is an almost iconic example of how not to make a sequel work, a fever dream of focus group-driven planning and bizarre ideas that end up even worse than they sounded they could be. This is absolute paint-by-numbers tosh. Which has achieved unifying both those who loved and disliked the first film and those who disliked and defended Part 2 in agreement that this could be one of the poorest sequels ever made. The thing is, if you break this down, removing the Fantasia moment, this is essentially a C-list 90s teen drama about a boy suffering through his new step-family and bullying. Not only is that part not even done well, but it also wastes the entire point of something with the depth of the NeverEnding Story. Totally homogenized, totally uninteresting, but then combined with the frankly embarrassing elements involving Fantasia, it's a heady brew of awfulness, and it's not a surprise that it has been considered such a disaster for so long. This is a Happy Meal version of my so-called life, with added rockbiter singing Born to be Wild. There are so many questions here. Why is Julie Cox's childlike empress so clearly no longer a child? Why have the Fantasia creatures seemingly all had brain transplants and become complete morons?
May I talk to you for a second? I'm a little lost.
And where exactly has Atreyu gone? In the simplest visual terms, the decline of the series can be seen in the changing faces of Falkor the Luck Dragon, from legitimately cute and wise to red-eyed and tired to what on earth is that?
This is not my favorite part of the story.
In watching the third film, I actually look back at what I said about part 2 and reflect on how much worse it could have been. It's still objectively bad overall, but it is still a competently made movie. From a technical perspective, part 3 makes part 2 look like the final season of 6 Feet Under. During filming, director Peter MacDonald was quoted as saying that the NeverEnding Story 3 would appeal to all nationalities and ensure a fourth film. I can honestly say I've had a very good time directing what I hope will be a vast improvement on the first 2 films. Given that the film went nowhere in most countries, MacDonald was barred from his own edit, Escape from Fantasia is easily the worst of the 3 movies and one of the poorest sequels of all time, and that this crash and burn ended this iteration of the NeverEnding Story film series, I'd say in hindsight, pretty much every part of that quote is untrue. In many of the movies we will be covering in this series, the failure of the sequel would come down to one simple sentence. It was a bad, unnecessary idea in the first place. But for the NeverEnding Story, at least the initial sequel was, theoretically, not a bad idea. There was no need to try to come up with a fresh approach. The second half of the source material was there and ready to be adapted. Not that I think it really needed a sequel, but it was a viable option. Although when it comes to sequels, being a viable option is less than half the battle. The real proof is in the pudding. How that sequel is delivered is everything. Over the decades, critical sentiment has shifted somewhat on the original NeverEnding Story film. It has become generally acknowledged as a fantasy classic. It currently has an 84% score on Rotten Tomatoes, even higher than the audience score. Equally, disdain for the second and especially the third film has hardened. Earlier in this video, I talked about how the nothing seemed to represent depression, and going beyond that, the story told in the first movie feels like a metaphor for the stages of grief and the recovery a person goes through as part of the grieving process. Deep stuff for what ostensibly is a kid's movie, but that feels like part of the reason it has remained important for so many people who are now adults. The threat in the NeverEnding Story is existential, invisible, internal. The villains in the later movies are paint-by-numbers characters without any sort of interesting motives. The sequels lost the essence of what made the NeverEnding Story work, and by part 3, all goodwill is chucked in a dumpster and set on fire. The NeverEnding Story remains beloved to this day, as shown by it making a return to cinemas for its 40th anniversary. The original book has been translated into 45 different languages and gone on to sell 8 million copies worldwide. An animated series ran for 2 seasons in the mid-90s, and a live-action series, Tales from the NeverEnding Story, which took yet more liberties with Ender's source material, made it onto HBO in the early 2000s. News of a brand new series of NeverEnding Story films has also rumbled on for what feels like decades, but complications with securing the rights have scuppered all attempts. Despite this, it has remained hot property in Hollywood. In more recent years, Stranger Things' use of the original 1984 theme tune helped bring the story to the consciousness of a new generation of viewers, and earlier this year, it was confirmed that the estate of Michael Ender, who passed away in 1995, had agreed to co-produce a new series of NeverEnding Story movies, with the production house behind the likes of The King's Speech, Lion, and The Power of the Dog. Now that there is a new film series on the horizon, maybe there will be a happier conclusion for a movie saga steeped in memories for so many. Michael Ender's estate clearly wants his work to be remembered differently on the big screen. But I'd personally rather we started to see some different stories told. That original movie is my childhood, and I'm tired of endless remakes and reimaginings anyway. With the original film franchise, however, there is still an undeniable sense of what might have been. The first film was so striking, so engulfing, such a unique proposition and overall package, treating mature subject matter and fantastical ideas with equal amounts of respect, that the sequels feel like nothing but a soulless missed opportunity. When I'm a dad, I look forward to watching the NeverEnding Story with my kid when the time is right. I don't think there could ever be a right time to bother to introduce them to the sequels though. Wolfgang Petersen's original film remains an indelible part of 1980s cinema, and that is something which no number of bad follow-ups could ever completely turn to nothing. You might say that its legacy is never ending. Next time on Sequelpalooza. After a truly wild production, a chaotic party legendary even by Hollywood standards, Caddyshack eventually hit the green, delivering profit and establishing new movie stars in the early 1980s, and became acknowledged as one of the best sports comedies of all time. But when it came to the much delayed follow-up, how did Part 2 end up being labelled as the worst sequel of the decade? Caddyshack tries to hit another hole-in-one, but shanks it into the deep, deep rough. All that and more in the next episode of Sequelpalooza. And now, a word from our sponsor.